So how can we register routes now? Well, we get this routes array, and here we now pass JavaScript objects to this array. And every object represents one route and the configuration for that route. And here, one very important option which we need to set on every route is the path option. This tells the router for which path, that's the part of the URL after the domain, a certain component should be loaded. For example, that we want to load a certain component for /teams, so that if our domain.com/teams is loaded, a certain component is loaded. And that's the second option we want to set here, the component option. Here we then define which component should be loaded by the view router when the user visits /teams. And in my case, that would be the teams list component here. Currently, I'm loading the teams list component here in app view with the dynamic component. I got my navigation, which emits a set page event. That happens when either of the two buttons is clicked in there. And then upon setting a page, the active page data property changes either to teams list or to users list. And that are my two components here, teams list and users list. The two components which I also registered here in my app component. And that simply then switches between these two components. This is a way of doing it, but it does not update the URL and it's not shareable. But it is the teams list component which I want to load here for this route. So in this main.js file, we now want to import teams list from /components teams.list.view. And then set component here equal to teams list, telling the view router that it's the teams list component that should be loaded if we visit /teams. And that's not the only route we want to load. Instead, I will duplicate this configuration here to also register a /users route. And here we want to load the users list component. So therefore, we now also import users list from components users list.view and load this for this /users route. And now we registered these two routes. Now the routes are configured, but a couple of things are missing to make this work. For one, at the moment this router is only stored in this router constant, but we're not doing anything with that constant. We need to make our view app aware of this router which holds these routes. And we do this by going to our app, and on this app we have the use method. This is a built-in method which in the end allows us to connect our view app with a third-party package with some other functionality. And here we simply pass the router to use. And this makes the view app aware of this router. Now that's a first step, but one important piece is still missing. The view app is now aware of these routes thanks to view router, and theoretically the view router sees that if we visit our domain /teams, we want to load this component. But it's missing one important piece of information. It doesn't know where to load this component to. At the moment, we're giving no hint at all to the router where this component should be rendered. And thankfully, it's not just taking the component and replacing everything on the screen with it. Instead, we need to use a special component to let the view router know where to render it. And we can replace this dynamic component with that new special component, since we're not going to use this dynamic approach anyways. So instead here, in app view, let's say inside of this main element, I want to render the selected route component. And to let view router know about this, we can use another component which is now built in. I'm saying now because it's built into view router and therefore only available because we're using the router in this view app. But since we do that, we now got a new built-in component, and that's the router view component. And that's in the end a placeholder telling view router that this is the place where the selected routed to component should be loaded. And we can, by the way, now also get rid of these two imports here, teams list and users list, in app view, and not register them as components anymore, because we don't need to do that. We're not using these components in our template by using their selector. Instead, we select them here through the router. And if you do that, if you load a component through routing, you don't need to register this component additionally as a global or local component. You don't need to do that. So with that, we now let the router know where to load that, and hence we can save everything and reload. And we won't see anything on the screen because at the moment we're just on our domain /nothing. Now, the routes we registered were /teams and /users. So let's try those. Let's enter localhost 8080/teams, and we see the teams page. Let's try users, and we see the users page. And now we got shareable links. But of course, our navigation isn't working anymore. And that's definitely not what we want. We want to make sure that we can still navigate from inside the page and that we don't have to enter the different URLs manually. Nobody uses web pages like that. So let's see how we can navigate around with routes then.